It's always great to be here to continue the conversation about corporate governance and specifically on setting the tone at the top on enterprise risk management. So there's a man who was in a hot air balloon and he realized he was lost. So he reduced altitude and spotted a man below. He descended it a little further and shouted to the man, "Excuse me, can you help me? I promised a friend I would meet him about an hour ago, but I don't know where I am." So the man below responded, "Well, you're in a hot air balloon. You're hovering about 30 feet above the ground. You're somewhere between 39 degrees and 40 degrees north latitude, and somewhere between 59 degrees and 60 degrees west longitude. You must be an actuary," the balloonist said. And the man below responded, "I am. How did you know?" Well, the balloonist said, "Everything you told me is technically correct, but I have no idea what to do with the information. And frankly, I'm still lost. As a matter of fact, you haven't been any help to me whatsoever. And if anything, you've delayed my trip." The man below responded, "You must be in senior management." The balloonist responded, "Well, I am, but how did you know?" Well, the man below said, "You don't know where you are, and you don't know where you're going. You got to where you are today based upon a large quantity of hot air. You've made promises that you have no idea how to keep, and you expect people that are beneath you to solve your problems. Frankly, you're in no different position than you were in before we met, but somehow now it's my fault. So, if you want to know how to set the tone at the top on enterprise risk management, ask for the right information and know what to do with it." Now I'll take your questions. So listen, as I was preparing for today, I recognize this is actually the 6th live presentation that PAMIC has sponsored in just the last 13 months where corporate governance was a topic. So I was thinking to myself, so what do you want me to cover? So I asked 2 of your fellow mutual company CEOs, what is it that is drawing people to another event on corporate governance? What do you want to hear? What do you want to know? And so I heard the same thing from both individuals, so it must be right. I heard 2 things. One is pending regulation on corporate governance or no pending regulation on corporate governance, I'm still looking to understand the value of putting in place corporate governance practices, changing my board practices, putting in place an enterprise risk management framework. I'm still looking to understand what's the value to my company. And by value, how does it make my company stronger? How does it help my management practices? How do I produce better financial results? How does it improve my capital position? What's the value of making these changes in corporate governance and enterprise risk management? That's the first thing I heard. Second thing I heard was, assuming you can get past the first, I need a roadmap. I still don't know what specific practices to put in place at my firm for my size company. Not one size fits all. I'm still looking for a roadmap, particularly in the areas of enterprise risk management. What do I need to put in place in order to set the tone at the top that enterprise risk management is as important to the organization as executing my strategies, as growing my revenue, as producing combined ratios under 100? So I'm going to assume that was good feedback, and that represents most of you in the room, and I prepared some slides and remarks along those lines. I'm going to try my 2 goals for today. Much like Joel, I want to try to help you recognize the value of setting the tone at the top on enterprise risk management. That your company will benefit by putting these practices in place, starting at the board and senior management down through the organization, that the success of the company depends on how well we're managing the key risks of the business in a very disciplined, transparent way. And second, I'm going to offer you some ideas, some practices that you could put in place in your organization, beginning as quickly as next week. Some might take longer, but I'll offer you some ideas of what you can implement along the way. So they're the two goals that I have for today, hopefully to help you set the tone at the top on enterprise risk management. So I've used tone at the top a couple times already, and I really don't want to take it for granted as to what does that mean. You really have to turn to the accounting profession because that's really where it originates. And so the first definition comes from COSO. I think you all know COSO, they're the organization that promulgates everything there is to know on internal accounting controls and enterprise risk management. And so they define it as the operating style and personal conduct of both management and the board of directors. So the other two organizations there might add the term ethical atmosphere and ethical conduct, but I think it's pretty much all the same. You know, we're talking about the board and senior management, their actions, their decisions, their communications, their values, their behaviors, or the absence thereof. That's what setting the tone at the top means. So in essence, it's everything you do and everything you don't do sets the tone for your organization regarding the importance of oversight and governance of key risks in your business. I am going to use collectively top to mean board of directors and management. I think we all understand that boards are governance and oversight, management is execution and implementation. But for the sake of our discussion today, I might use the term interchangeably and refer to both board and senior management as top. So when we talk about setting the tone at the top on enterprise risk management, that's what we're going to be referring to as we continue along the way. So I'm going to cover three things. I'm going to cover the first one very quickly. Joel touched on some of the issues. I don't want to be redundant. And actually, the first one has nothing to do with the two goals I just set for my remarks. It doesn't add any value. I'm not explaining the value of setting the tone at the top on enterprise risk management, and I'm not offering you any ideas on how to implement it. But as Joel did, I think you have to be aware of what's going on, particularly in the financial examination process. Again, I'll be quick. It'll be a very small part of my remarks, but you have to be aware of it. Because if you choose to do nothing, recognize that the regulators will be evaluating, assessing, and eventually reporting back to you on the performance of your governance and risk management practices. And I've already seen it start with private letters to management already. I have not seen it in any financial examination reports in any states, but I have seen it in management letters to CEOs as a result of the financial examination process. So I'm going to touch on that. I'm going to spend most of my time on enterprise risk management. You can't set the tone at the top on ERM if we don't all agree on what it is. And so I'm going to define it. I'm going to talk about its components. I'm going to talk about a few practices of what you can implement in your organization to set the tone at the top on enterprise risk management. And again, I've found over the last several months that there's still, I would say, a variability as to what is this thing called enterprise risk management. How is it different than how I've managed risks my whole career? And so I think it's important to have that as a base of understanding as we move forward. And then I'm going to end with 10 practices that I think you can implement in your organization that, in my mind, without a doubt, you'll be setting the tone in the organization of the importance of enterprise risk management. These practices, I believe, will add value to the organization, but I'm pretty confident they will also meet the expectations of regulators and rating agencies, but that's not why I'm offering it to you. I think you heard Joe, if any of you who were here yesterday, you heard Joe DeMemo talk about it. I presented these techniques and approaches to him and his staff. And so I feel pretty confident that certainly in the state of Pennsylvania that they'll be received well. But that's not why I'm doing it. It's to talk about the value you can get from your organization from implementing these various board and governance practices. Sound okay? So, I'm going to start with a very quick topic, again, because I don't want to be redundant with Joel. Joel referred to the Financial Condition Examiner's Handbook. If you're not familiar with it, it's a 500-page document that the NAIC publishes that your state insurance departments have to follow in completing a financial examination. And in that document, you can't get past page 1. The first sentence of page 1 in the preamble that talks about one of its main purposes is to assess the quality and reliability of corporate governance. This is the first sentence of page 1. There are separate sections in the Financial Condition Examiner's Handbook about assessing board practices, corporate governance, and the risks that companies have identified in their organization. And so these are words lifted right from the handbook. This is how the examiners are going to assess your performance in the area of risk management. How well have you established a risk-aware culture? And what's your governance practices over risk? How do you identify individual risk? How do you prioritize? How have you set risk appetite statements and risk tolerance statements and risk limits? And do you have risk management strategies in place? And what kind of controls do you have? And after you put those controls in place, what's the residual risk left that the company is still assuming in their organization? This is all part of the risk-based financial examination process. You should be aware of it. On individual risks, there's a section called branded risk that they go through and actually assess and determine what risks you have in the organization. They have to complete what is called a risk assessment matrix that has to identify individual risks in 9 different branded risk categories that you see there: credit, market, pricing, underwriting, reserving. They go through a process where they will, needless to say, evaluate how well you're doing in assessing, in identifying, managing, measuring, assessing, and mitigating the key risks of your business. So again, I wanted you to be aware of it, and I prefer to stop here because I feel like I'm starting to sound like Steve Johnson up here talking about the importance of the financial examination process. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you should be aware of it, and because if at the end of the day you really don't think there's any value to any of these practices, you will be evaluated on them in your next financial examination process. So that was the first agenda item that I said I'd like to spend time on. So this is really where I'd like to spend most of my time, and that's on enterprise risk management. Again, you can't set the tone at the top on ERM if we don't agree on what it is. So I'd like to define it. I'd like to talk about the 3 components of ERM, and through that process talk about some of the practices that you could implement in your organization to provide oversight and governance of enterprise risk management in your organization. So I thought COSO did such a great job of defining tone at the top. I went to them to define what is enterprise risk management, and I think they let me down, because I don't know about you, but to read the culture, capabilities, and practices integrated with strategy setting and its execution that organizations rely on to manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value. I don't know about you, but that's not very clear as to what is enterprise risk management. So for my own benefit, I had to color code it. So not for you, but for me. And so just to break it down, culture, of course, is what we're talking about. Setting a risk-aware culture in your organization, setting the tone at the top. Capabilities and practices are what are the practices you have in place to identify, measure, and manage risk, your enterprise risk management framework. They expect ERM, the gurus in ERM, expect it to be integrated with your strategies, your operating activities, and your business. It doesn't sit aside over here and you manage it differently. It's part of your strategies. It's part of the way you manage the company. It shouldn't be separate and distinct. It's a component of how you manage the business. So it has to be integrated. And at the end of the day, it has to create value. And by value, I believe it means you're producing consistent operating earnings, producing a consistent level of capital adequacy, making sure that you have a sufficient capital base to support your business strategies over the long term in your chosen risk appetite. So that's the definition of enterprise risk management. What is ERM framework? What is that then? So building off of the definition of ERM, it's a disciplined process to systematically identify, measure, manage, and mitigate the key risks of your business. Hold on a minute, I lost my pages. It's managed at the top of the organization, at the board level and the senior management level. It is applied consistently throughout your organization, and it is designed to provide assurance that you are managing the key risks of the business in support of your overall strategy and capital position as you move forward. There are three components of an enterprise risk management. You need to establish a risk-aware culture in your organization. You need to have a process to identify, measure, manage, and mitigate risks. And you need to have some form of an enterprise measuring stick, some capital model to measure how you're going to assess the overall risk appetite of the organization, how you're going to deal with risk correlations. And so they're the three components of an enterprise risk management framework. I'm going to spend my time on ERM predominantly on the first one, because setting the tone at the top is creating a risk-aware culture. I think it makes sense for us to spend most of our time on the first component. I am going to spend a few minutes on the second, the process to go about to identify, measure, and manage risks. And I'm just going to spend no time on the third topic about capital modeling or any kind of a measurement tool to economic capital models or otherwise. That's a subject unique into itself. We can always talk about a follow-up down the road. So let's talk with the first two components. They need to be in place, by the way, before you can really be talking about capital modeling anyway. So let's start with risk-aware culture. So to set the tone at the top on enterprise risk management, there really needs to be 5 practices that you put in place in your organization to set the tone at the top of the importance of managing the key risks of your business in your organization. So it starts with, there are 4 roles you need to define in your company in order to appropriately govern and manage enterprise risk management. And I believe all 4 roles can be created without adding to staff. So we're just talking about assigning responsibility and accountability to people in your organization. So if the first one starts at the board level. We heard Joel talk about it. There has to be some board committee or the board itself that has to have oversight of enterprise risk management. And so it can be either, the rating agencies and regulators and sort of the ERM materials. It's okay if the entire board takes responsibility for enterprise risk management. You don't have to necessarily assign it to a committee of the board. I've actually seen it split all 3 ways. I've seen where companies, even companies of your size, create a risk committee that has oversight. I've seen where they've asked audit committees to pick up the responsibility, and I've seen where the board has chosen to continue to have it as a board activity to do. I think it's whatever works for your company. There's really no, preferred way of doing it. You have to decide that for your organization. The one thing I would say, though, there's 2 things that I think you should consider as you do create this role at the board level. One is it should be documented. You should write down exactly what the roles and responsibilities are in the area of governance and oversight of ERM. If you do assign it to a committee, they should have a committee charter that outlines the governance and oversight duties and responsibilities very clearly. And so you should have it documented wherever the responsibility lies. And second, I wanted to offer you a rule of thumb at the board level. If your board is spending less than 45 minutes to an hour a quarter on managing and governing your enterprise risk management framework and the key risks of your business, my belief is they're not fulfilling the role expected of them in the oversight and governance of risk management. And you'll find out later as I continue to talk about what ERM is, if you're spending, I don't know how you could possibly do it at the board level if you're not spending that amount of quality time talking about the key risks of the business and getting a briefing and status of how well management is doing in managing the key risks of the business. So that's the first role. The other three roles. The next role is you're going to need an ERM committee of senior management. The CEO should be on it. It's generally in small and mid-sized companies the same group as your management team. It's not a separate group, but this is the group that is responsible for driving the ERM activities in your organization. Typically, it might be a quarterly process that's established. Sometimes it could be monthly, but again, I encourage companies to integrate it with any other operating type meeting that you're already doing. But essentially, you need sort of an ERM committee of senior folks in the organization to drive the execution of your ERM practices. The third role is you're going to need a chief risk officer, somebody in your organization that has the best knowledge of identifying risks, of risk tolerance levels, risk appetite statements. Most companies assign it to the CFO, their general counsel. They don't actually create a chief risk officer position, but somebody that has knowledge of the material and somebody that will assume the administrative role of making all this stuff happen. The communication, the meetings, updating the materials for the board. Somebody's got to make sure this gets driven with the organization. So there's an administrative role too. And then the fourth role that you need to have is for every individual risk that you identify that will be managed within your enterprise risk management framework, you're going to need an individual risk owner, somebody that has ownership and responsibility for that risk. Even if it happens to be a risk in your organization that maybe has accountability in several departments, there still should be one person that can drive the organization to making sure that everything associated with that risk is being executed, being reported up through management and the board of directors. So four roles that have to be created in order, as one of the first practices to set the tone at the top, that you're creating a risk-aware culture in the organization. The second practice, if you're not familiar with these three terms, you might as well get used to it. They're not going away. You're going to need to define a risk profile of the organization, a risk appetite, and a risk tolerance level. If you read the COSO work on ERM, they also add terms like risk capacity and risk limits, and I actually encourage most companies I find them to be redundant with these three terms. Start with these three terms, get them defined. I think there's a lot of value in defining these terms for your organization. The very next slide, I'm going to define what these three terms are for you. So more to follow on this, but again, setting a risk-aware culture, you're going to have to define these terms in your organization. I mentioned in the definition of ERM that it has to be integrated with business strategies. So I still see a lot of companies that don't have strategies. There are no mission statements. There are no what's the long-term strategy of the organization. There are no core values at the organization. Core values mean what does the company stand for? What is the culture of the company? Do you believe in integrity, trust, honesty? Do you believe in accountability and teamwork and customer service? What's the company stand for? What are the values of the organization that you hold on to no matter how much stress there is in the business? If you want to create a risk-aware culture, you've got to create sort of values as part of the organization. So again, if you want to create a risk-aware culture, you need to have these documents. And I'm not talking about a 26-page binder that sits on somebody's bookshelf. You can do this pretty succinctly in a page or two. that people can pin up on their cubicles and other things. I mean, it can have staying power, and it doesn't need to be a very verbose document that nobody actually looks at, after it's created. Joel touched on this as part of the Corporate Annual Governance Model Act, but clearly, a risk-aware culture starts with performance reviews and incentive compensation, tying, obviously, starting with senior management, their overall performance and compensation with the execution of the risk management strategies and initiatives in your organization. And the fifth item talks about transparency and reporting. What goes with an enterprise risk management framework and setting the tone at the top is that everybody in the organization, from frontline employees up through management and board of directors, understands the key risks of the business. They understand the risk profile, appetite statements, tolerance levels. They understand how the organization is doing throughout the year in managing those risks. It's a very transparent process that gets communicated to the organization. By doing so, I think you'll see significant benefit to the organization. You won't have exceptions to particular in the transaction process that fall outside of your risk appetite or outside of your underwriting guidelines. You'll have better operating performance. You'll see a consistency that takes place by the fact that everybody in the organization understands your framework, understands the key risk issues relating to your organization. So, 3 terms. I'll try to do this quickly. 3 terms that you need to be aware of. The first, what is a risk profile? It's a narrative description of the parameters for executing the company's business strategy. So it's a narrative, and essentially it represents what risks are you willing to assume in your business to execute your strategies. So it's what you're willing to, the risk of the company. Everybody has one. You've been in business for over 100 years. You have a risk profile that you've been willing to assume in executing your strategies. How well is it documented? You may know it inside and out as a senior officer and board of directors, but how well do all your employees understand? What's the risk profile of the organization? It's typically not a single statement, by the way. You describe your risk profile. These happen to be 8 categories that follow AM Best's expectation of how a company documents the risk profile. And there's actually more than 8 because the operational section really is a catch-all for operational issues. But you define your risk profile generally in these areas. In case you're not rated by AM Best and you're curious, well, how do the regulators stack up as far as risk profile? Well, they use terms like branded risk and critical risks and prospective risks. And maybe the terminology is slightly different. It's pretty close. So as you're thinking about documenting the risk profile of the organization, again, what are the risks you're willing to assume to execute the strategies and initiatives of your organization? You generally need to describe it in a narrative fashion in these general areas. So that's a risk profile. What's a risk appetite? So a risk appetite would be the boundary level of the amount of risk that a company is willing to assume in executing its strategies. So if, again, risk profile is what you're willing to assume, a risk appetite statement is what you're not willing to assume. And I've seen companies define their risk appetite either as limits of assumption of risk or, in the negative, what I don't want to assume. So a simple example might be, I'm willing to write property and general liability and offer limits of liability on the casualty side up to $10 million of policy limits, maybe $25 million of TIV per location on property. I'm willing to assume that as part of my strategies. A risk appetite, that could both be a risk assumption, and I'm also talking about it's a risk limitation or a risk appetite. I'm not willing to write workers' comp, I'm not willing to write automobile, I'm not willing to write professional liability. You're defining, again, the risks you're willing to write and the risks you're not willing to write. You're defining, again, the risk profile and then the limitations of your risk profile in the risk appetite statement. These are narrative documents and part of an enterprise risk management framework. Why do it? I would tell you that there is so much benefit to be gained throughout your organization, because I can assure you that there are people in your organization who don't know that what risks you're willing to assume, or what risks you're not willing to assume. And I've seen this where you're going to see benefits, a more consistent execution of transactions and your initiatives based upon defining the risk appetite and risk profile statements in your organization. So the third term, these are examples of risk appetite statements, by the way, just like risk profile. It's not meant to be a single statement. It really matches the risk profile. I don't expect, by the way, with this list I would really discourage you from having a risk appetite statement that covers all these areas. Think of this as more of a laundry list of items to look at. I would encourage you to have a succinct risk appetite statement that pretty much follows the way you've defined your risk profile. So the third term, risk tolerance level. And so if the first two were narratives, this is the metric. So what are the financial metrics that establish thresholds for your organization? These are generally set at an enterprise level. So generally, there's probably anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6 risk tolerance levels that organizations set at the enterprise level of thresholds that they want to make sure all the people in their organization are aware of as they implement their risk management practices. I'm going to just put them all up. These 3 to 6 or so tolerance levels are generally in 3 areas. Capital management, balance sheet strength, and operating performance. If you go back to the purpose of an ERM framework and why do all this, you're looking to produce more consistent operating earnings. You're trying to make sure you have a level of capital adequacy that can support your business strategies over the long term. Therefore, you need to set metrics that help guide you through that management of risk, that those financial goals are being achieved. So companies generally at the enterprise level set these at risk tolerance levels, and then clearly they're reviewed along with other operating performance measures at board meetings, at senior management meetings on a regular basis. So you need to set risk tolerance levels within your organization at the enterprise level. So back to the story, 5 practices that you need to put in place to demonstrate that you're setting the tone at the top on enterprise risk management in the organization. You put those 5 practices in place, and I can assure you that both inside your company and outside your company, people will recognize that the board and senior management are doing a good job of setting the tone and the importance of risk management in your organization. So I said I was going to cover 2 of the 3 components of an enterprise risk management framework. So I covered the first one, how to establish a risk-aware culture. I'd like to just touch on the second one. And the second one is how to go about identifying, measuring, mitigating, and monitoring the key risk factors of the organization. So there's generally 2 approaches you can take. Most of you have already either started or have this in place. But there's really 2 approaches. You can either take a top-down approach, or you take a bottom-up approach. But there's no way of getting around it. You've got to go through sort of all functional areas, all practices, all processes of your organization, and develop an inventory of the risks of the organization. As you all know, there's probably hundreds of risks that every insurance company has that you're managing over time, that you've been managing over time. This happens to be a list of what I believe are 26 common risk factors of most property and casualty insurance companies, and I've just chosen to put them in 5 categories. Most of you have all these 26 risks. Maybe you don't have currency, but for the most part, most of you have all these other 26 risks. As you go, whatever process you go through in the identification process, you're going to go through a process where essentially you're going to be inventorying these risks, and you're going to be choosing which risks you want to manage within your enterprise risk management framework. I encourage you to keep it small. I wouldn't do more than 8 to 12 of these risks that you choose to manage in a very visible, disciplined process with communication up through your management and board of directors. You can always add more risks later, but get the process down, get the communication, get the value of the risk identification process under your belt, and you can always add it later. But there's no way of getting around it. You have to go through an identification process. Most of you are already then having to put some assessment of frequency or severity on each risk in order to determine that it fits the top 8 or 12. So the likelihood or the impact, frequency or severity, how do you really determine what the top 8 or 12? Again, you could get very scientific. I actually encourage most companies, use your experience and instincts. They're not wrong. You've been managing these risks your whole career. You've been doing a fine job for the most part in doing so. So don't ignore that experience and judgment as you go through this process. Don't try to make this an overly scientific process in selecting the 8 to 12 key risks of the business. But once you do select them, you have to have a method to manage and report on them. And so I would encourage you to have something like this for each individual risk. This, I just simply call this an individual risk dashboard. Happens to be an example for a catastrophic event risk, but I would encourage you that for those 8 to 12 risks that you select, create a dashboard. That on one page, you can report all of the key issues associating with that particular risk. Define it, who's responsible for it, who's the key risk owner, do you have separate risk tolerance levels to determine that it's performing well, what are the key risk management strategies and controls that you have in place that you're counting on to mitigate that risk, have those controls been tested lately and what's been the result of those testing. Overall, are there any risk mitigation issues? Because let's face it, not every practice is fully in place. Again, it's a transparent process. Don't be afraid to admit, I don't really have the metrics in place to manage this risk or this management control. I need to identify that and make sure it gets corrected at some point in time in the future. The bottom part is just a status report. What's really changed from the previous quarter. So when you get into a rhythm of reporting on these individual risk factors in a dashboard from quarter to quarter, again, it'll absolutely be helpful to understand what's different this quarter versus as I reviewed that risk last quarter. You really are going to need something like this, some tool like this, in order to efficiently manage the key risks of your business up through the board of directors. And earlier when I said 45 minutes to an hour at a board meeting, what is the board going to do? What is the committee going to do? Well, they're going to be reviewing all 8 to 12 individual risk factors and understanding how well is management doing on each of those individual risk factors. There should be certain risk factors that a board gets full briefing on, not just reviewing dashboards. If loss reserves is one of your key risks of your business, how can you not once a year have a full briefing to the board of what the reserve level looks like? How does it compare within the actual range of estimates? How well are the reserves being set for the organization? If that's a key risk, should that be one of the risks that you have a full briefing with your board of directors? I could go on with reinsurance and catastrophic events, or maybe now we've all heard about cybersecurity. There are certain events, certain risks that probably require a full briefing at the board of directors. And I think there's every opportunity for you to spread those briefings throughout the year. Like I would encourage you to do those more than one at a particular quarter. You can spread them out. But again, when I look at the 45 minutes to an hour that I suggested you spend time on this, by looking at these individual risk dashboards, talking about risk appetite statements, risk tolerance levels, getting a full briefing on certain factors, you can easily see that's not an easy process to take place, but that's really what's expected of boards in the governance and oversight of enterprise risk management. So I hope I've shared some of the benefits of ERM throughout my remarks so far. If I haven't, this would be sort of a summary of what I think the benefits are. I think there's real value to your organization. Even if you're doing a great job of managing these key risks within the functional departments of the organization, there is always some fine-tuning benefit that you're going to get from managing these key risks in a more disciplined way through an enterprise risk management framework. You will produce more consistent operating earnings. You will produce a more adequate level of capital over the long term to accomplish your business goals and objectives. It's going to make you sharper. You're going to be measuring more things, so you're going to see benefits in operating efficiencies to be gained. I actually think one of the biggest benefits is you'll actually improve risk-taking in your organization. You'll be creating a much more prudent, positive risk-taking appetite in your organization because you're going to be defining it more so. So I definitely think you're going to be improving how your people in your organization assume risk in their day in and day out duties and responsibilities. Ultimately, ERM increases accountability in the organization. You have to define owners. And so you're going to increase the level of accountability and ultimately the execution. And I think ultimately it's got to help you on your ratings with your rating agencies. It will improve it over time. You know they've been emphasizing it, but it's got to benefit the overall rating, even if it doesn't move you up a grade, as AM Best has represented that we could actually move you up a notch. We all know it probably can move you down. So even if you debate whether it can move you up, it certainly will help your position of maintaining the best ratings possible for your organization. So that was the second agenda item I said I was going to cover, which is you can't set the tone at the top on enterprise risk management if we don't agree on what it is. They are all the practices that I think you might want to consider if you want to set the tone at the top at both the board and senior management level of the importance of measuring risk in your organization. So now let me summarize some practices that you could think about putting in place when you get back home. Some of these I've already talked through, so I won't be redundant again. I just find it's a good summary as we end the discussion. I've separated these practices into two categories. The first one that I'm going to go over are actually things technically outside of an enterprise risk management framework, and the second group of 5 are all within an enterprise risk management framework. So 10 items that I'll summarize for you. And again, some of these I've already touched on. First is you got to have a strategic plan. You got to have mission statements. You got to have core values. You got to have strategy. ERM is supposed to be integrated. You've got to put something in writing with respect to where are you taking the organization. Where are you going in the future. It's part and parcel to managing the key risks of the business. Of course, you got to have an enterprise risk management framework. You can't set the tone at the top if you don't, and it has to have many of the attributes that I described today. You have to assign it to either the board or a committee of the board, document it, as I said before. Again, enterprise risk management starts at the board level through senior management. So you have to make sure you have accountability and responsibility at the board level. If you don't already, you need a code of conduct and business ethics, and you need annual certifications of the board and senior officers. Most of you do that. The question I have is, does it get reported back to the board? Does the board actually see when you do these annual certifications, is the board reviewing them? Most places I've seen, they're not. And again, if you go back to what is setting the tone at the top, it's the things you review, the information you ask for, the information you don't ask for. If you want to set a risk-aware culture in the organization, and there's importance with you with respect to ethics, with respect to conflict of interest, with respect to compliance with regulations and laws, if the board is reviewing how well management and the other board members are doing, I think you're setting the tone at the top of the importance of that, of those attributes. And Joel touched on this as part of the Corporate Governance Incentive Disclosure Model Act. If you do have incentive compensation in place, cash bonus plan, incentives in place, again, make sure the components are tied to company performance, make sure that there are ERM components within it, that the maintaining a risk appetite and risk tolerance. It's not all about combined ratios and revenue growth and operating earnings, and make sure there are clawback provisions in the incentive comp. For those of you who don't know, clawback provision would be the right of the company to take the money back if there were, for example, accounting restatements that took place. The company needs the right to take the money back. That's a clawback provision, should there be any accounting irregularities that are discovered after the bonuses are paid. So they would be sort of the first 5 practices to set the tone. 6 through 10 all relate to enterprise risk management. So risk tolerance level and risk appetite statement, apologize for using an acronym, but it didn't fit on the slide, is make sure they're drafted, make sure they're available, make sure they get reported up through the board, make sure that any changes to those statements are reported as well. With respect to these individual risk dashboards, again, make sure they're done at least quarterly. They get updated quarterly. They get reviewed by the management committee. They get presented to the board of directors. Give the board time to review them in advance. Materials need to be out prior to the day before the board meeting. So it takes time to fulfill the director responsibility, make sure the materials get to your board members in time for them to spend time preparing for the meeting. I mentioned this already, there are risks that the board needs to be fully briefed on. And it takes a little scheduling, but there are certain risks. I've offered you a couple examples here I did before of some of the risks that maybe require full briefing at the board as to how well the company is doing in measuring, managing, and mitigating these key risks. I don't want to miss what I really believe is a key aspect of enterprise risk management. I think there are still many organizations out there that do not have fundamental operating practices in place, do not have metrics in place to manage the key risks of the business. And if you've already embarked on putting an enterprise risk management framework in place and you do not have practices and processes and measurements in place, you've built a foundation that might give you some false security that you're doing a great job of managing risks. Make sure you have fundamental practices in place to ensure that those risks are being mitigated, and make sure you have metrics in place that help you understand how that risk is being managed. Don't assume it. And know that this person is doing this, and that if you don't know the practices are in place, and if you don't make sure that they're operating effectively, if you don't have metrics, put them in place, and stop assuming that everything's working fine. And while I didn't touch on the capital side of this, ultimately the whole purpose of enterprise risk management is really to make sure your capital level is adequate both currently and prospectively, to make sure that you have a sufficient level of capital to execute your long-term business strategies. You're going to need to do some forecasting of future financial results. Most of you do operating statement forecasts. I still see very few companies forecast balance sheets or capital adequacy ratios. And if you really want to bring this all together, you're going to need to start improving your forecasting method to include balance sheet and capital adequacy ratios. Start with 1 year out. I mean, ultimately, again, the experts in this field would say try to do 3 years out. I recognize the uncertainty of even forecasting revenues next month, let alone next year or the second or third year. But you really need to start looking out and making sure your capital adequacy levels are there to support your business strategy. If none of you have tools to do this, I assure you, every one of your reinsurance brokers has these tools and would be happy to help you in this regard. So there are the 10 practices that I think if you embark on them, you will, without a doubt, be setting the tone at the top that enterprise risk management is an important, critical part of your organization. And I assure you that both inside the organization and those outside the organization that see these practices in place will give you very high marks for setting the risk culture of the organization on the importance of measuring key risks. And don't forget about my first message, ask for the right information and know what you want to do with it too. That wouldn't hurt you. So I'm completed my remarks, so I'd be happy to take any miscellaneous questions. I think I have 3 minutes to go. So
I'm just curious, you have a broad scale of companies here, some much larger than others. The smaller companies, of course, have less resources to dedicate to this type of activity. What's your suggestion on how they should address that?
The question is for small companies, they might not have the resources to dedicate to creating an enterprise risk management framework. Any suggestions I would have for small companies? Is that generally, how do small companies end up? I think the biggest hurdle is the starting point. I think if you can get past the starting point to maintain an enterprise risk management would be well within the resources of companies of the size in this room. It's creating the risk tolerance statements, the dashboards, the processes, and your first dashboard. That does take work. Some companies do have to reach outside their organization, at least to get sort of a process going. I've helped some companies, but all they needed was, again, a roadmap. What do I put on a piece of paper? So I think the biggest hurdle is the starting point. But once you get past the starting point, I think that even organizations of the size of this room, if the board and the management team think it's important, I think you'll have the resources to continue it. But I do recognize that the starting point is a hurdle. And so I think you have to find a way of get past the hurdle, and I think you'll find it's not a lot of extra work, particularly if you can find a way of integrating it into your normal processes. Don't create separate board processes, don't create separate management processes. If you're meeting with your management team to review monthly or quarterly results, you should be reviewing your risk management performance at the same time. Don't create separate routines, because I can assure you, and I've been there, it'll fall by the wayside. Because you have many hats. And again, there are priorities that you'll be making, and you just don't want this to fall off. There's others in the room that probably are better able than me to answer that question, who have done it. And so I would encourage you to reach out to other people in the room who've somehow been able to get past the initial hurdle.
Joe. In a similar vein, have you ever encountered, I'll say, like pushback that all of this additional structure that you're imposing on the organization reduces the company's, if you will, flexibility or ability to take advantage of new opportunities because, frankly, you got too disciplined?
I've heard that before, Vin, and I guess it depends on how you implement it. So I think it's a good question. Vin asked, by putting an enterprise risk management in place, does it reduce the flexibility of the organization to really respond to opportunities and transactions that might come your way? I think it's how you implement it. So what I would suggest to all of you, when you're setting risk tolerance levels, when you're setting risk appetite statements, create an environment where anybody in your organization can propose changes to those. It's just a level of communication that has to take place. If today you don't write workers' compensation and that's in your risk appetite statement and your head of underwriting wants to consider that, well, there just needs to be a conversation about that up through the board of directors, because we're going to increase the risk appetite of the company. What's the return that we can expect from that decision process? So I would encourage you to, again, as you implement this, make sure it's implemented where there's flexibility to adjust for this and that anybody can propose changes. The only thing that's really implied with this is you have to have a communication about it all the way up through your board of directors, because inevitably you're increasing the risk tolerance of the organization, and shouldn't that be something that people up through the board of directors are aware of? So again, it's to establish prudent risk-taking. We're all in the risk-taking business. Let's make sure it's not a restriction from taking risk if it's prudent risk. Anything else? Well, so we'll have the Q&A session. I guess it's at noon, so we can ask any other questions at that time. So thank you so much.